Simone already said that this conference is about different aspects about climate, and I, of course, do also some research related to climate change, but more recently I think a little bit more about goal setting. And I thought, okay, now let's try to talk about goals and pledges here. Now, why? Now, because you all know this whole discussion about climate targets, right? So basically you have the 2 degrees targets. Some people say, okay, 1.5 degrees target. And of course it's a problem to achieve it. And there are some demonstrations in this one, of course, in Germany, as you see from the language, right? Where people say, okay, now this is really the limit and we really need to have a stronger climate action in order to fulfill those kinds of targets. But in my research, I try to understand a little bit better where those targets are actually coming from and what is really the role of those targets. So that's why I basically try to talk a little bit about different aspects here today. So first, in the first part, just probably what most of you really know, but sort of like talk a little bit about this evolution of the climate targets over the last decades, right? Where is that actually coming from? But then I would like to go into the functioning of such goals and targets. And Simone already has mentioned that I also work on behavioral economics, so I thought, okay, I try to bring in something on this, basically what is sort of a behavioral economic view on why people or why groups may set some goals for themselves. And then also he was mentioning that I did some experimental work, and so I also try to sneak in some of those ideas into this presentation. Okay, so that's sort of the plan for today, and of course feel free to interrupt me at any time if you have questions or comments, or just say, okay, no, it's complete nonsense what I'm talking about here. Okay, so now if you think about something like a 2 degrees target, I mean, you may have seen this very old paper from Nordhaus, right? So that's sort of like a picture just taken out of his 77 paper, Strategies for the Control of Carbon Dioxide. And so the quote is out of his 75 paper, basically where he says that if there were global temperatures more than 2 or 3 degrees above current average temperature, this would take the climate outside of the range observations which we have made for the last several hundred thousand years. So basically that was sort of his idea. And if you now look at this, so basically in this figure, right, I mean, I think this is sort of one of the earliest mentioning of something like a 2 degrees target, which is kind of surprising coming from Nordhaus, at least what I always think about Nordhaus is sort of like, okay, we have this kind of DICE model and we have this kind of integrated assessment, and maybe an optimal global temperature increase might be even something like 3 or 3.5 degrees. But sort of he came up with something like that in his very early work. We said, okay, now there is some kind of trade-off that we actually have. And this similar thing's been basically got reiterated by sort of the advisory group on greenhouse gases feeding into the UNFCCC process, where again, sort of like one basically tries to look at the riskiness of having these different temperature ranges, where you say, okay, now maybe below 1 degrees warming, low risk, whatever that means, high risk above 2, and of course you already see that, okay, is that something like little arbitrary to put it 2 or 2.1 or 1.9 degrees, right? But of course 2 is something nice because it's also like a focal point, right? It's sort of like easy to communicate. It's much easier to communicate than 2.05 or something like that, right? So, but one sort of needs to come up with those ideas. And of course, that's also then what has been taken up in the process. If you look at the UNFCCC 92, right, they're basically just mentioning that greenhouse gas concentrations should not lead to some dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system, whatever that means, but again, very, very vaguely stated. A little bit later in Germany, at least the German Advisory Council on Global Change also came up with something like a 2 degrees target. If you read the second quote here, basically they came up with this kind of like tolerable windows approach, again referring back to sort of the past, and then say, okay, now if the temperature range is exceeded in any direction, too cold or too warm, maybe this kind of causes some trouble. We don't exactly know where, And then they basically say here, if we extend the tolerance range by a further 0.5 degrees at either end, so that's relatively arbitrary, right? But sort of like, okay, let's just give some margin of error to both sides. Then the tolerable value extends from 9.9 to 16.6, and which essentially corresponds to something like a 2 degrees target. But you already see here, it's kind of like, okay, it's fed by just insights about or some ideas, about some kind of climate variables and not really the economic cost of achieving those targets, which basically entered those kinds of discussion in the early phases. Okay, and then if you go to even further, say to the Paris Agreement, then of course here we have the 2 degrees target mentioned, the increase in global temperature to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and of course due to the emphasis or the moves by, in particular, some developing countries, some island states, etc. Basically, they also came up with mentioning the 1.5 degrees targets, where they say, okay, now at least we mentioned the 2. We want to have well below 2 degrees that we want to achieve, but we also want to put in efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees targets. But in that sense, now, however, the question is how to understand those kind of targets. Okay, and here there's Pep Canadell, who basically was also negotiating and then sort of like been involved in this global carbon project, where he basically says, okay, now essentially this 2 degrees target is something like a social construct, right? Of course, it's informed by some of the climate science, but in the end, it's not really that it's such a clear threshold that above 2 degrees everything goes to hell, right? So it's kind of clear that it's, into formulating these kind of targets, we already see that, okay, it's some kind of focal point. 2 degrees is not easy to communicate, but also it's kind of driven by also what might be needed on the climate side, but also what potentially could be achieved in terms of the costs settings. Now, if you go back to Nordhaus, in his Nobel lecture, he basically says, okay, that of course there are all these temperature targets floating around, and for example 2 degrees, but he views them more or less as an aspirational goal. Right? So he says, okay, the target approach is questionable because it ignores the cost of attaining the goals. If, for example, attaining a 1.5 degrees goal would require deep reduction in living standards in poor nations, then the policy would be equivalent of burning down the village to save it. If attaining the low temperature path turns out to be easy, then of course we should aim for it. Right? So he basically always pushes the side, okay, no, it's basically cost benefit, and so we should not just rely on climate scientists, essentially, right? Because it's important to at least consider the trade-offs and the cost of achieving this. In particular, if it's not such a clear threshold that basically really everything collapses above 2 degrees, right? If that would be the case, but then damages all of a sudden explode, then of course it's clear that we should try to definitely be below that, right? And so. And his work, for example, in the 2016 version of the DICE model, basically says, okay, now, and it's again a quote from his Nobel lecture, where he said, okay, at least in that version of the model, it's not really 1.5 or 2 degrees target, but rather in his setting, basically we have 3 degrees in 2100. To achieve in terms of the optimal climate change, right? So in that sense, he again mentions the climate target, 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees, or whatever you say, as some kind of aspirational goal. So now there's recent literature in Nature Climate Change by Hensel and et al., where they say, okay, now let's just revisit this DICE model and just update it according to new estimates and new empirical foundations. For example, let's just update the carbon cycle model, let's the temperature module, let's adjust the damage function to newer estimates, and also, and that's of course an important parameter here, put in some kind of social discount rate, which is more in line with what these authors also have assessed, how people view the world when they ask different experts, economists, philosophers, etc., to say, okay, what's coming out, and they say basically in their Nature Climate Change article that, yeah, no, actually, if you do the Dyson model, we find that 2 degrees is something like an optimal target, but you see that it really depends on the assumption that you bring in. Okay, and this leads me to this point that I really would like to focus on in the rest of the talk, to say, okay, now what is really this kind of motivations for putting up these kinds of targets? Otto and Hell, so in a paper, they basically try to distinguish 2 different motivations. So one is really this kind of like some more normative setting on looking at the uncertainties, right? That's sort of like this precautionary principle approach, which is heavily driven just by the climate angle and not necessarily looking at the cost setting, right? So maybe that's where those kind of targets are coming from, and historically they came. But on the other hand, of course, it's not just that we set those kind of targets based on some kind of views or normative views on climate damages and or cost-benefit analysis, but also, of course, the targets may have a different function. Right? So they also can be seen in themselves as policy instruments. Once they are formulated, then the question is, do they have some kind of impact that really we try to work harder to actually achieve those targets by implementing specific policies. But of course, if we want to formulate such targets, then the question is, I mean, why do we formulate a temperature target? Why don't we formulate a damage target? Why don't we formulate maybe some target along other dimensions, right? And of course, what is needed in order to formulate any target or any goal is that we need to have some kind of understanding of sort of the system, right? How emissions map into concentrations, how concentrations map into some kind of climate variables like temperature, for example, or how climate variables map into the damages, right? And depending on the uncertainties in each of those steps, it may make sense or may not make sense to formulate a target along one specific dimension. Because this is sort of the idea that depending on the uncertainties or depending on the system knowledge in those different dimensions, we can decide which dimensions we should use in order to set the goal in. But of course, another dimension is, okay, once we set the goal, and this also relates to maybe personal goal that you set for yourself, right? You want to write a paper and submit it before Christmas, or you want to write a referee report, welcome, please, for Jim to write those referee reports in time, right? And of course, you set yourself a goal, and then sometimes one doesn't really achieve it. And now the question is, what do you do then? Are you then just frustrated, or do you just say, forget about the goal, or do you adjust the goal, right? And this is also the world where we are now in, to a certain extent, right? Where at least some people say that, achieving the 1.5 degrees target is extremely hard, and maybe we don't do this anymore. And so now the question also is that once people realize that, maybe we are short of achieving this goal, does it now lead to some kind of more frustration where you say, okay, then forget about it. Everybody has said we always need to achieve this goal. Now we don't achieve it, so then basically let's forget about it. Or do people say, okay, now we adjust it, right? And of course, it's clear that 1.5 is great. 1.6 is also fine. 1.7 is also fine, right? So there's some kind of flexibility in here, right? It's not that we have this clear threshold where damages really explode. And because of that, and because of this continuity, there might be a backlash from having formulated a goal, which then turns out to be not achievable, at least given the current needs. So that's my take. So with that, the next step then, of course, is now if we set ourselves goals, and like a climate target that I was mentioning, what is again happening if we don't achieve it, right? And to a certain extent, we also need to look at the legal action that is being possible, right? Can people sue governments, for example, if they then don't have formulated these goals or have agreed to certain international agreements, and then sort of like don't really put in policies in place that are inconsistent with those kind of targets. And now, of course, here, like Climate Action Network and other organizations, they threaten the European Union or Commission, basically, to come up with legal action against their kind of climate policy. In Germany, there was a successful complaint in front of the Federal Constitutional Court that sort of like the climate law, so to say, in Germany, the Climate Action Plan did not really specify the emission reductions beyond 2031, and that's sort of like not in line with the constitutional arrangements. So essentially having formulated a goal may also lead to an opportunity of some players in society to really sue the government, and then the question is, okay, this may be strengthening the functioning of this kind of goals. Okay, but with that, I would like to go into the discussion of why to set those goals. Right, and already along the line that I've discussed, we saw some functioning where these climate targets came from, but also what hopefully the function could be. But I would like to take a step back here and first give you some ideas on sort of motivated from a more behavioral model. Okay, so now like Nordhaus was saying that somehow these targets, at least in his view, are some kind of aspirational goal. Okay, so now what if you set up some kind of aspirational goal, of course the question is first, where to set the goal? And then, given that the goal has been set, maybe for yourself, for society, for your group, how does this affect your efforts? Right, and here in the climate example, that would be mitigation efforts in particular. Okay? But more generally speaking, you can always just say, okay, we set a goal and we have some certain effort, and then there might be some kind of uncertainty how the effort maps into goal achievement. And that's sort of the world that I would like to talk a little bit about. Of course, there's a huge literature, and this slide is extremely crowded, on goals and aspiration. Also, Kaparos et al. And also Bad Haasa, they have some kind of more dynamic pledge and approval models, which are kind of a little related, more driven by these ideas on international environmental agreements. Here, however, what they have in mind is that different players, countries, set a goal or say pledge a specific contribution, and then others have to approve or not, right? And this, in a dynamic world, can actually lead to some good outcomes. In a different kind of literature, it's more this functioning of aspirational goals, where basically goals may serve as some kind of commitment device. Right? Essentially, once I set a goal, I try to work hard to achieve that goal, because otherwise I may feel some kind of loss sensation, or maybe politicians will be voted out of office because they've promised certain things and then have not achieved it. Right? So that's sort of the mechanism there. It works for politicians, but it works also at the individual level. And this literature really goes back to the 1940s in psychology, at least for individual goal-setting behavior. Okay? And the one thing that I would just want to highlight here is some very simple quasi-hyperbolic discounting model. I'm not sure exactly if all of you are familiar with this kind of idea, but essentially it's an idea where maybe in one period you have sort of some effort cost, right? That's sort of the cost here. And then in next period here, or a little bit later, you may have some kind of benefits from a performance. The performance, of course, depends, maybe with some noise on your effort level, but then also you may have some kind of loss sensation because your performance Q may fall short or may exceed your goal, which is here just denoted by Q bar. Now, what does this quasi-hyperbolic basically mean? That basically means that this beta parameter kicks in. So it's not really an exponential discounting model, but rather a what they call a quasi-hyperbolic discounting model, where everything but today gets this additional discount factor beta. So basically at the time when I choose my effort, sort of the benefits are in the next period. So basically they got discounted not just with the standard discounting factor delta, but additionally the beta. But now, if I think about goal setting, then I can take a step back. Basically before even the period before I basically choose my effort, I can choose my goal. And from that period perspective, everything in the future is in the future. So basically also the effort is in the future. So the relative weight between effort costs and whatever benefits I accumulate from the performance then does not get this additional beta discount. And this basically leads to some kind of potentially leads to some kind of dynamic inconsistent behavior where as a current self, basically at the time when I set my goal, I basically try to play a game against my future self, right? Basically saying, okay, I try to choose a goal to commit to a larger effort level. So I basically understand that if I now set a larger goal, then also I increase the efforts. Now this whole thing, of course, has been typically formulated within or for individual decision making, and you may say, oh, what does this have to do with these kind of climate goals, right? But of course, there are also papers by Matt Jackson and others where they say, you know, if we have a collective decision to make, right, like a group, but we kind of differ with respect to our discounting factor, basically how much value we give to the future. Then if we rely on something like a median voter theorem or some kind of other aggregation of the individual preferences into the group choices, like a utilitarian principle or something, then also again we may end up with something which exactly looks like this quasi-hyperbolic or hyperbolic discounting, where at the group level similar inconsistent behavior basically occurs. Right, so this kind of model again just leads to a situation where conditional on my goal, I try to formulate my effort, and now the question is in the first period, how should I set my goal? Okay, and of course, this is relatively sensitive to sort of the structure, how effort maps into goal achievement, but it's also clear from just looking at this in a qualitative way that if I don't feel any losses from not achieving the goal, then goals are not effective at all, right? So if I just don't care about having not achieved the goal, I don't need to set myself a goal because it doesn't have any function. Okay, that's sort of like this lambda here, 0, it's not effective. On the other hand, if the beta, so basically the extent to which I run into these kind of time inconsistencies, if this beta is 1, so I'm basically a standard exponential discounter, I don't need to set myself a goal because I don't have this dynamic inconsistency. If I make a plan, I follow through with this plan, so no matter what. So again, goals don't have any function in this kind of world. If, however, the beta is extremely small, it basically just means that here I completely discount the future. Again, whatever goal I set, I don't care at the time when I basically set my my effort level. So depending on the kind of loss sensation, so how much I really care about goal achievement or not, and depending on the extent of my dynamic inconsistency, these goals may or may not make sense. And this just I would like to highlight by just looking at a very simple parametric model where sort of the effort costs here are quadratic, the benefits are kind of linear, and then we just have this kind of loss function basically from not achieving the goal, where I say, okay, now if my performance is better, so Q is larger than the goal, which is set as Q bar, then I don't feel any losses, and beyond that, basically if my performance is worse than the goal that I have set, so basically if I exceed the temperature, then I feel this kind of loss sensation depending on how far off I am with my goal achievement, right? And now here one basically can look at exactly this idea how first this kind of discounting parameter beta affects goal setting and goal achievement, as well as how the uncertainty between effort choice and performance matters for my goal setting behavior and also for the goal achievement. Now this figure here basically just fixes the uncertainty. So this delta is essentially now here just like a uniform distribution, right? And you basically have some kind of noise, as you see here. So basically the epsilon determines the percentage to which I achieve how my effort level maps into my performance. And because it's sort of like the expectation is 1 of epsilon, it also means that sort of if I choose a specific effort level, then expectation my performance is exactly at that level. Okay? But it might be beyond that, or it might be below, right? I'm not really sure about the mapping between here, my action, and the performance. Now, if we fix the delta, and now just look at, okay, what does this beta actually now mean? So if I beta equals 1, so basically I'm just an exponential discounter, clearly, I mean, I don't really need those goals. So that's sort of the first thing. So what we basically see here, that also the probability of not achieving the goal basically goes to, is getting very small. But also what you see is here that, I mean, even though the goal is not effective, the goal basically, we set that at a level which basically just guarantees that I don't feel any loss sensation. That's sort of like basically the idea. But if the beta is kind of smaller, you also see that there's this kind of point here where below that, the goal is actually larger than my effort level. So basically, I set myself a goal, and I know an expectation I will not achieve it. But still, it has a function, right, because it increases my effort level. However, if I'm becoming more and more exponential discounter, so somehow then it doesn't really make that much sense to affect my efforts through the goal setting behavior, because that's just not needed, because I'm not really in this kind of inconsistent behavior that much. And their goal setting is really detrimental to a certain extent. It still helps a little bit, but also if I set a larger goal, I kind of handicap myself because I feel a loss sensation, because there's this kind of noise that I'm not achieving the goal. Right? And these kind of trade-offs then feed into the optimal goal. But also what you see is that here this yellow line is kind of like if the effort level that I would have if I don't set any goal in this model, right? And now here the blue line, of course, is always above that line. So basically goals here really have a function that they discipline myself to work a little harder. And the same thing one can do with just say, for example, fixing the beta parameter and just looking at the uncertainty, basically increasing the variance of that kind of the distribution. Again, here you basically see that only if there's hardly any uncertainty, then somehow the goal is above the actual effort level. But if there's large uncertainty, so there's this large chance that I actually don't really reach the target, then I try not to put it too high target and sort of like the effort level is rather above the goal that I want to achieve, because I would just suffer too much from having this kind of loss sensation. Right? So one basically can play a little bit around with those parameters, but it already tells you that here, if you now are in this kind of world where uncertainty is little, then of course you see that the effort level is relatively high. If the uncertainty gets larger, basically the mapping from effort into performance gets more variable, right? Then the goal doesn't work as good and the effort decreases. Now, what does it tell you? Now, if I think about what dimensions I want to set my goal in, I probably should choose a dimension where I have a relatively good understanding between my effort choice and goal achievement. Right? The more variance there is, the more uncertainty there is, the less valuable is this kind of goal, and it doesn't really help me in order to induce additional effort. So that's sort of like the lesson here. And of course, one can reformulate the model and also allow for some kind of uncertainty regarding the beta, no, not the beta, the B, so basically benefit from my performance and or the cost of the performance. of choosing the effort level, and this is why it's that important now, because if I'm at the time when I set my goal, I'm not really sure how important it is to, or how costly it is to have the effort choice, or how important it is to reach a specific climate goal, for example, then I may want to change my goals over time. Right? Because if I learn more, I may learn that climate is a bigger problem than thought, or is a lesser problem than thought, right? I may want to adjust my goals. But if I do so, and if that's extremely easy, then again, goals lose their function, right? So which is kind of like a strange thing, right? Because in that sense, I need to have a goal which is kind of, I would like to change it, right, according to new information. But if that's too easy to change a goal, then I can forget about this goal setting from to begin with, because I can just say, okay, no, I don't reach it, I just adjust it, that's fine. Right, so we need to have some kind of inflexibility to change the goal, at least some kind of cost. And this is really then what can be applied to this kind of like line of having this system between emissions, climate states like temperatures and damages, to then say, okay, now in what kind of dimension do I actually want to formulate the goal, and how should those goals be updated over time. Okay, so with that, I would just like to highlight or talk a little bit about, in the remaining few minutes, about one paper with Juliane Koch, where basically we said, okay, now instead of explicit goal setting, we just formulate some kind of pledges. Okay, so everybody just says, oh, I want to do this, I want to contribute to the public good at this level. But what we are interested in here is that at the time when I formulate the pledge, there may still be some uncertainty regarding the cost of actually contributing. Right? So if you apply that to the Paris Agreement or something like that, I formulate a pledge, for example, we want to be, I don't know, carbon neutral by 2050, but maybe there's still some kind of uncertainty regarding the economic development, regarding technologies that are being available, etc. Right? So the cost of achieving such a target might be uncertain. So that's sort of like the focus on in this work. And then the question is, how does this uncertainty now affect the pledge level / goals, and what is then the effect on the later contribution decision? Okay, and given the time, I'll probably just say a few words about this. So this whole is an experimental paper. It's very simple in its structure. So we basically have what is a typical linear public good formulation. Everybody has some kind of wealth level. Then we have some contribution decision Q. It's costly. The cost may be high or low. Right? So the CI may have some high costs, may have some low costs, and that may be uncertain when I pledge first. And of course, we have some kind of benefits from the public good that we receive. Okay. Now, in such a group setting, there's of course a different function of such a goal or pledge. Right? It may first, if I pledge a specific level, I may myself feel bad about not adhering to this pledge later on. But that's sort of like exactly like what I talked about before. Right? Once I said it, maybe it disciplines myself also to work hard and to contribute at this level. Now, if you think about this mechanism, now if I'm uncertain about the costs that I will have of contributing this amount, maybe then I pledge a little less to begin with. Right? This uncertainty may lead me to pledging at a smaller level. Now, however, we are in a group setting. So basically, I can also think that if I pledge something, the other people will see that. Maybe it also affects their decisions. Right? So if I pledge high, and they think, okay, that's probably trustworthy, it basically thinks that they may think that, okay, I really contribute at a higher level. Now, if there's some kind of conditionality or reciprocity, however you want to call that, they may also be driven to contribute at a larger level. Right? And so it's not yet clear how uncertainty now all of a sudden will lead me to change those kinds of pledges. On the other hand, if assume that we are in this world. I have said, okay, now I will contribute 50% of my endowment into the public account, and now all of a sudden it turns out that, wow, it's extremely costly. And I have a great excuse. I say, okay, I really wanted to, but it's just too costly. Sorry, I'm not contributing this much. Right, so maybe also, if that's the mechanism, then I can pledge a lot, right? Because I later on have an excuse. So maybe this, to what extent the goals, or here the pledges, bind myself or affect my own behavior may be driven by the realization of the costs later on, right? While if the costs that I actually have are relatively little, they have no excuse to not adhering to my pledge. Right, so again, it really depends. So uncertainty may affect not only my initial goal-setting behavior, but also to what extent I feel bound by whatever I have said I'm going to do. Okay, and this is sort of like what we try to do here. So people have some specific endowment, they can contribute up to a level of 20, and then they have these kind of costs, which are either 0.6. So basically, if I contribute, say, 10 tokens, my costs would just be 6 euro. If I, however, have a high cost draw, if I contribute 10 tokens, my cost would be 18 euro, right? So it's a huge difference between a factor 3 between the cost that I would have in order to adhere to this. So now the different treatments are as follows. We basically have a control group where we have homogeneous group, everybody has high costs or everybody has low costs. Okay? And they know that at the time when they make the pledges. The second, we have cost heterogeneity. There are 2 players with a high cost, 2 players with a low cost in the group. Again, they know when they make the pledges what the cost levels are. Third, we have cost uncertainty, but homogeneity with respect to the cost. So they know that it will either has all in the group will have high costs or all will have low costs. But at the time when they make their pledges, they don't know exactly what the cost realization is. But they know that everybody faces exactly the same problem. And the fourth treatment here, we have cost heterogeneity and uncertainty. So basically they know that there will be this random draw and 2 people will have high cost and 2 people will have low cost, but they don't know exactly who that will be, right? So basically at the time when they make their pledges, they all have exactly the same information, but they know that some will have high costs later on and others will have low costs. And then the other treatment I mentioned here is basically the extent to which other people grade me based on those kind of pledges. So the first one is a no review. So basically I just do it and the others just will realize what I have done, what I've pledged, etc. But there's no feedback mechanism. And this review basically means that, okay, I do this kind of things, I pledge and I contribute, and the other players then will give me some kind of school grades based on that, right? So basically to put a little bit more emphasis on, I may feel bad about not adhering to my pledges. So that's basically the idea. Okay, so now, this is exactly how it works. So basically we have where people have the information, they get the cost information here, then they pledge, the pledges are made public in the review mechanism, then they basically get the school grades on that, they contribute, and then they basically make their contributions. And in the uncertainty treatment, so basically they make the pledges are made public, and then only afterwards, basically they receive their cost information, and then they can decide to contribute or not. Okay, so what is the outcome? Maybe not surprisingly, if I now just look at the pledge level, so not the contribution, just what people actually pledge, right? So if they have low cost and they know that, right? So they basically pledge 14.6. If they know that they will have high cost, they pledge significantly less. Okay, if there's some kind of cost heterogeneity. Okay, now it's a little bit higher here, but those are not really significantly different. But you basically see that then the low cost, they pledge even a little bit more. The high cost also pledge a bit more, but it's not significant. So now if you introduce uncertainty, here we have this 12.3, which basically it's closer to the high cost treatment, basically saying that if I'm not really sure what cost I will have, if I now have to pledge and nobody else will grade me on it, basically I say I'm really hesitant to pledge a high contribution, right? Because I may face these kind of high costs later on, and then I don't adhere to my pledge, so I rather pledge a little lower. So that's sort of like the idea here, okay? But then, if we have the other treatments where people actually grade me based on my pledges, okay, then it kind of looks different. I mean, first here you see that there's really not much going on if people know exactly their cost level at the time when they make the pledges, but under uncertainty there's really a change. And in particular here, you see that sort of like the pledges, at least in this homogeneous treatments, are much closer to the low-cost pledge under certainty, which basically suggests a little bit that, okay, I want to get a good grade, but I also know that if I pledge something, okay, I get the nice grade, but later on I will have an excuse for not adhering to my pledge because, okay, sorry, we had the high cost draw. And this in particular, however, applies that if I know that everybody else also will have a high cost draw. Because everybody has this nice excuse, and then we just say, okay, we pledge something, but forget about it. We all face the high cost, and so we don't really feel bound by this kind of initial goal that we have set. Under heterogeneity, it's a little different. There's kind of like a mixed thing, because I know that okay, I may want to pledge a little higher because I say, okay, I may have an excuse, but I know that also if I pledged higher and then it turns out that I have a low cost and others have a high cost, that I may still feel bound by whatever I've said because the other guys will have an excuse and I don't have an excuse, and so I have to really do what I promised. And now we can look at the contribution decisions, and this is sort of like also where you see that on average, at least under uncertainty, there's a increase in the later on contribution decisions if we have this initial uncertainty regarding the pledges. It's a little bit all over the place. So basically the review mechanism really helps to increase the contributions. The initial cost uncertainty has some kind of minor impact on the subsequent contribution decisions because sort of it also affects the pledge level and adherence to the pledges, and so it's really the effects are going in different directions. Okay, but what this kind of work should do is to give some ideas about how, and I view these pledges as somehow like personal goals that I communicate. I also try to affect others maybe through this kind of pledge making, but also it has some kind of effect onto myself. And if I'm now facing this kind of cost uncertainty, it leads to some kind of more cautious or conservative pledges. And so basically that I may don't want to pledge too high because I may face to be the high cost types, but if I think that other people will give me a nice grade on just having made a nice pledge, then all of a sudden this result turns around. But of course, what also comes out here is that this pledge and review, so there's other people grade me based on my performance or based on my pledges, really is important because it leads to higher pledges and also increases contributions and also compliance level. I have not talked about this in the following. So I will probably just jump to the conclusion given the time, right? We wanted to finish by 10:10. We also have other work where we basically say, okay, now if we are more in this world where we have kind of like really this jump, basically like a threshold public good game where only if we achieve a specific threshold, then all of a sudden we get some additional benefits, then in such a situation, this communication of pledges is even more important than in this kind of like continuous public good game that I just have talked about right now, but also in such another setting, the uncertainty, or there it's not cost uncertainty, so basically the cost that I have in order to contribute a specific amount, but rather the costs are fixed, but I don't really know how close I come to reaching this threshold. So there's some kind of threshold uncertainty. That threshold uncertainty, of course, also matters and interacts with this kind of pledge making. But the overall lesson from this kind of literature is, yeah, pledges really make sense. They increase the also later performance, and one of the mechanisms is kind of consistent with what I have talked about before, that basically some people at least feel that once they have pledged something, they also need to adhere to that and should not fall too short of their promised contribution levels. So in that sense, these kind of goals serve as a commitment device, but they also signal to others. And I think further research really needs to dig a little bit deeper into the dimensions in which one really should set those kinds of goals. And we see that for the climate example, right, where for a long time one really has focused on temperature goals, right, or concentration goals, etc. But now with this implementation, we really say, okay, now let's formulate much more like net zero by 2050 or something like that, right? Where we say instead of now having these kind of temperature goals or temperature targets that are being formulated at the forefront, one basically says, okay, now let's just go to formulate precisely something in terms of emission scenarios, right? And maybe like net zero is kind of like a nice goal, or basically how to decline with those emissions over time. And of course, if you now think about this in terms of the initial model, it kind of makes sense, right? Because sort of like the mapping between emissions and realized temperature is kind of uncertain, right? And we will figure out maybe in 2100 what exactly the temperature is. But it relies on some kind of model prediction and also involves some kind of uncertainties, while if we formulate goals which are much closer to what we actually can choose, right, like emission goals, then it's much easier to at first understand the mapping between efforts and emission scenarios, but also it's easier to control. So this kind of idea on how, at least in this modeling world, how goals can lead to some kind of losses if I don't achieve it, and may also have some kind of consequences for politicians, etc., if they don't implement the right measures in order to move towards this goal. Right? This is much clearer the more, or the less uncertain the mapping is between effort and performance. Okay? And with that, I think I would leave it to a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.